Welcome to the Adam Messer Show. I'm your host, Adam Messer, and I interview authors, artists, and entertainers. We discuss their process, how they overcome obstacles, and their creative works. I hope you enjoy the show. You've been listening to the Adam Messer Show. I hope you enjoyed our show today. All right, there we go. So my guest today, everybody, is author Steve Snyder, and Steve is with us today on the phone. How are you doing, Steve?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot, Adam.
Thanks for coming on the show today. And Steve Snyder wrote this book called Shot Down, and it's a really cool book. It's about his dad, Howard Snyder, and the crew of their B-17, the Susan Ruth. I'm just going to read a snippet from the back here on the back of the cover. Shot Down is a compelling story of our B-17 air crews that flew, fought, and died over Europe to save a continent from tyranny and oppression. There were over 56,000 downed airmen in World War II. Lieutenant Howard Snyder and the crew of the Susan Ruth were one of those crews that went down over Europe. The first-hand account of their experiences, including the bravery of the members of the underground who helped them, is a wonderful read and gives a great sense of the heroes that made the greatest generation. That's from General Duncan J. McNabb, the United States Air Force retired 33rd Vice Chief of Staff on the Air Force. I think that's a great summary of the book. So, Steve, would you mind just giving us a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll dive into some of the questions about your experiences and all.
Sure, sure. Well, I was born in Pasadena, California, and raised in that area. My mother was born and raised in Pasadena as well. My dad was actually from Norfolk, Nebraska, and moved to Southern California when he was 13. I went to college at UCLA, graduated there in March of 1970. My mother also went to UCLA. When she was at UCLA, she was a classmate of the legendary Jackie Robinson. And when I was at UCLA, I was a classmate of, for sure, the legendary Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So that was fun times. And after I graduated, I went into sales and sales management, and I had a 40-year career. The last 36 was working for a company called Vision Service Plan, VSP.
Oh yeah, I know VSP because I used to work as an optician.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I was like a lab manager and optician for like 10 years. So we used to have clients that had that they use VSP insurance. So that's kind of neat.
Yeah. They cover one out of every six people in the United States, so it's a pretty big company
Oh
that,
yeah, oh yeah.
as you alluded to, provides eye care insurance for eye exams, glasses, and contact lenses.
And that's not
And
an
I,
ad
re-
for VSP. It's just kind of a neat little coincidence there.
yeah, yeah,
Tell us about your background with the with writing because you got into that after you retired, right?
yeah. I retired from VSP in 2009, and I really have no writing background or training whatsoever. Uh, when I retired, I had the time to really delve into my dad's war history in more detail. I knew the basics growing up. I knew he was a B-17 pilot. He was stationed with the 8th Air Force in England during World War II. His plane was named the Susan Ruth after my oldest sister, who was 1 year old at the time that he went overseas.
Oh wow.
And he flew bombing missions over Europe, and he was shot down in February of '44, and he was missing in action for 7 months. But he evaded capture and got back to England. But like most World War II veterans, my dad didn't talk a lot about the war growing up. He really didn't start talking about it until 1989.
Oh wow. Yeah, my grandpa served in World War II as a Navy in the Navy, and he never really talked about it either.
Yeah. Those guys just didn't. They just looked at it as that they had a job to do. They went over, did their job, came back, and got on with their lives.
Yeah.
But in 1989, there was a memorial erected to my dad and his crew in the little village of Mackinac, Belgium, which is just north of the French border near where his plane came down. And he went over with the three other crew members that were still living at the time for the dedication of the memorial. And there he was reunited with all these Belgian people that hit him during the war and revisited those places where he was hidden. And that brought it all back. And he started talking about it after that.
Wow. So 40, like what, 45 years later.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
that's pretty cool.
So yeah, when I retired, I was just like I guess most retirees. I was taking it easy, um, just sleeping in, going for walks, reading books, taking naps, and doing this research about my dad. My main residence is in Seal Beach, California, which is in Orange County. It's about 40 miles south of Los Angeles. And so I started doing research, and I just became fascinated with the story. My parents had kept a lot of material about the war years, and there were two items that were really significant. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action about his plane being shot down, and it is absolutely riveting, and it's in the book. And the other item were all the letters that my dad wrote to my mother while he was stationed in England, and he was really candid in those letters. He wrote about what bombing missions were like, what life was like on his air base, what life was like in England and London at the time,
Mm,
escapades of him and his crew. And I just became fascinated uh, with the story after reading those letters, and it just became my passion.
that's really cool. One of the things I do on my show is, Steve, is I have my son actually plays music, so he's going to play a little bit for us, and then we're going to dive back into the shot down story. So
Great.
yeah, here he is. Sebastian, would you mind playing for us? And he plays some heavy metal music there, Steve. So this is Sebastian Messer, everybody. Thanks, Bass. That's pretty cool. I've actually got the book right here in front of me, Steve, and I thought it was really cool how you and I met. You were coming into town in Savannah at the Mighty Eighth Air Force Museum, and I wrote an article about it was I think Super Museum Sunday or something like that, and you were going to be out there at the Mighty Eighth doing a book signing, and I just remember I think it was like February of 2015 when I first met you, and I think the book it might have been out maybe like what maybe 6 months by then, something like that.
Yeah, it was published and released in August of 2014.
Yeah, so it was still
So that
relatively new, and you were just starting to do like all these different tours and speaking engagements and stuff like that, and I thought it was really cool because isn't the Mighty Eighth that you said he was with the Eighth Air Force, so like that museum is kind of dedicated to that group of individuals, right?
Yeah, and exactly. And I heard about Super Museum Sunday, and in 2015, it happened to fall on February 8th.
Mm.
And that was the date that my dad was shot down in 1944, on February 8th of 1944. So I thought,
Wow.
Oh my goodness, Super Museum Sunday, that's just too much of a coincidence. I need to come down and sign copies of my book that the museum sells out of their gift store there
And
in Savannah.
and my
And I've
signed
gone
copy
down.
actually says 2815 Steve Snyder. That's so cool. I did not know that aspect of the that's even cooler.
Yeah, and ever since every year since then, I've come down on Super Museum Sunday, and I will again this coming February in 2020 to
Yeah, I'm
sign
so sorry I
copies of
missed you
my
this
book.
year too. I don't know what happened. I know we had talked about it earlier in the year, and then it just didn't happen. So I apologize for that. But
Yeah, this last year actually, the day before on Saturday, um, this last February, before Super Museum Sunday, I made a PowerPoint presentation in the chapel there
oh,
at the
really?
museum. Yeah, so the museum is a fantastic museum. They have great people that run it, and I became good friends with all the folks down there, and I love going down to both Savannah. I love Savannah. It's a fun town to go visit, and also the museum, just a fabulous museum and a great tribute to
I I
the
think it's
men who
such a
served in the
gem.
eighth.
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah,
such a gem because if for the folks listening who haven't been there, it's located in Pooler, Georgia, and it's maybe 5 minutes down the road from the airport. So when you come into town, you can take the exit or whatever. But it's located off of like where I-95 goes down past the museum, and you can see like the planes outside, and it's really neat because it's a big attraction I think for people, but it's kind of like a hidden gem because a lot of folks like oh they really don't go unless they know about it, and it's right there, you know. But I think it's a big one for people that are, especially World War II history buffs and people that like any kind of military stuff because you can actually go up and see decommissioned planes and things like that, and it's pretty cool. They restored what I can't remember was it a B-17 that they restored out there or a B-52 or something like that. That's
well, B-17, they have some planes outside the museum, but the one inside that they've completely restored, it's called the City of Savannah,
yeah
uh, is a B-17, like the plane that my dad flew. My dad was the
yeah
pilot,
that
and they've restored that. That's the most restored B-17 in the world.
oh
This is
really
absolutely, yeah. It's like it just rolled off the assembly line,
oh yeah it's
back during
beautiful.
World War II.
Yeah, it's
But
beautiful.
inside has everything works. The electronics and the radio and the turrets, everything works. It's really pretty cool. When I'm there, a lot of people say, I pass by here all the time, but
Mm-hmm.
I've never stopped by. And then once they didn't realize what a great museum it actually is.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. That's what I'm talking about. It's kind of like a hidden gem because you wouldn't go unless you knew about it, and people pass it like on Highway 80 every day. I mean, thousands of people drive by there, literally every week, and but I was impressed. I mean, like I went there for the first time when I met you, and we went around, and it was like a really cool experience, and so you have like done a ton of speaking tours. Let me do a station ID real quick too, because we do one we're a community radio station here. Everybody, you're listening to WRULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. I'm your host, Adam Messer, and my special guest today is Steve Snyder. If you're just now tuning in, Steve is the author of Shot Down, which is the true story of his dad, who was a pilot in World War II. His name was Howard Snyder, and this was the true story of pilot Howard Snyder and how the crew of the B-17, the Susan Ruth, how they were shot down and were able to avoid capture and rejoin the war efforts. So you said we were talking earlier about the diary that your dad kept and the letters that he wrote back to your mom. And that's one of the things with the book. You have actual pictures in there of the diary and pictures of, different things about, each chapter basically has, like a summary of what's going on, and then it has a picture, and there's a like on page 50, there's a picture of your dad. It says pilot Howard Snyder, and he's a very young man, in this picture. And how old was your dad when he was over there?
Well, actually, relatively speaking, he was an old guy. He was 28 years old.
Oh gosh.
Yeah,
But
that was considered old back then. He was like, the other crew members called him pops or grandpa.
why? Because he was like 10 years older than them, or
Well, yeah, because most B-17 had a 10-man crew,
yeah,
and the gunners were typically 18, 19 years old,
right, right.
and then the officers were typically in their early 20s. So he was a little bit older than most guys.
That's so crazy to think a 28-year-old is considered old.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, it's like he was the senior on the crew because he was 28.
Yeah.
Wow. I think back, I'm 43 now, and I think like, man, when I was 28, I know I was growing up and all that, but I mean, we've never had to experience anything, that magnitude. So,
Oh, heavens no, heavens no. Those they're called the greatest generation for a reason.
yeah, yeah. So your dad, you chronicle the all of these different things. How did you started doing research? How did you get to the point where, like, you've traveled a lot and you've talked with a lot of the different people? So kind of, can you give us just a walkthrough of what that was like when you were getting the information together for the book?
Sure, sure. Well, from various sources, I mentioned that they built that memorial to my dad and his crew in 1989, and I made my first trip to Belgium 5 years later in 1994 with my parents. That was the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium and my dad's plane being shot down, and that's when it became personal for me because he took me around and I got to see all these places where he was hidden, firsthand, and even met a couple of the Belgian people that hit him during the war. So I got a lot of information from my father, and then from some of I mentioned that there was a B-17 had a 10-man crew. 5 of the crew made it back home, but 5 of them did not. But of the ones that did make it back home, they had. I got information, written accounts, and articles from them. Also, I went on a quest after I retired to find relatives of all my dad's crew, even the ones who had died during the war, and I asked them for whatever information they could give me: pictures, articles, written accounts, letters, what have you.
Yeah.
And I read book after book about the air war over Europe. I went on the internet and spent countless hours doing research, downloading declassified military documents, mission reports, bomb group and squadron diaries, and the like. I joined a number of World War II organizations, started going to reunions, listening to veterans tell their stories. And then it was 3 years into my research that I finally came to the conclusion that the story of my dad and his crew was just so unique and so compelling that people needed to know about it. And so I decided to write a book. But I probably wouldn't have written the book at all if it wasn't for 2 Belgian gentlemen, Dr. Paul Delahaye and Jacques Lelot. And these 2 men were young boys during the war, and they were greatly affected by it. They saw firsthand the atrocities committed by the Nazis against family and friends. And later in life, they became local historians, and they interviewed all these Belgian people and members of the Belgium underground about events that took place involving my dad and his crew. And they documented their testimony, and they gave me unbelievably detailed information about events that would have been lost forever without their dedicated research. So I
wow.
really owe them a huge debt. And as you were mentioning, there's over 200 time period photographs in the book, many of them that were taken during the war by Belgian people that were either sent to my dad by his helpers after the war or who were given to me by Dr. Delahaye and Jacques Lelot. So that It's pretty incredible, all the pictures that were taken during the war in Belgium, that are in the book. It was just kind of funny when I was writing the book, because I had so much information and detailed information. I thought to myself, people who read this book, they're going to go, wait a minute, how the heck does this guy know all this detail about events that took place, 70, 75 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's unbelievably uh, detailed with the information that was provided to me by all these different sources. So from the time that I started my research to the time the book was published, it was 4.5 years.
Oh wow.
But I was really, I'm so fortunate and so blessed to know so much about my dad and his crew. As you mentioned, I go all over the country to air shows, signing copies of my book and making lots of presentations. And I meet a lot of people, and I hear the same story over and over and over again, that from people that know very little or nothing about their veteran, whether it's a son or a daughter or a grandchild, or a cousin or a niece or a nephew, that because they say they didn't talk about it, their vet didn't talk about it, and by the time they were really got old enough to realize the importance of knowing about it, it was too late.
Yeah, yeah,
So
that's
yeah, I'm really fortunate.
that's exactly the same story with my grandpa. Well, my grandpa Roger was in the Navy in World War II, and then my grandpa Jimmy was in the Korean War, and neither one of them really talked about it. But towards the end of my grandpa Roger's life, he talked a little bit about it. He was telling me that he had gone to Tahiti, and I don't know, but that was about it. He didn't really talk about like his job or anything like that. Now my grandpa Jimmy, he was in the Korean War, and he had this scar down his arm from where the ship that he was in was blown up. And I found out a little bit more about his story because my aunt had done some research, and he'd lost his medals and stuff like that, and she had submitted for I guess replicas or replacements of the medals or whatever. And so we learned a little bit more about that. But he had received a Purple Heart, and then he got some other award. I can't remember what the award was, but it was some other award for helping save some crewmen and stuff like that. So but I think that's very true, because that generation of folks, they didn't really want to talk about it. And I mean, it was not just a couple people. It's like everybody had some part to do, and either out there on the war front or here at home, and they all just were like, okay, well, we're done, we're moving on. You know?
They did not consider themselves heroes. They didn't want to be looked at as heroes because, as you mentioned, it was a united effort. Both the guys who served in the military and all the people at home that were involved with the war effort. So that they just considered that they did their little part, even though they were heroes, and they just wanted to get on with their lives and raise families and get back into civilian life.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's interesting, and at this point, we have a lot of, like, I think I saw something the other day. There was a World War II vet, the oldest living World War II veteran, had passed away or something like that. And I remember as a kid, it was a little kid in the 80s. I think it was the late 80s, maybe not late 80s, might have been the middle 80s. But the oldest living Civil War veteran died.
Yeah.
And I just remember that, thinking like, wow, we think back to the Civil War, and to the 80s, like, okay, so that's like 130 years. I was like, how could that be? So I don't know. Or it might have been someone that was, I just can't remember, but something like that. It was either late 70s or early 80s. But, that's kind of where we're at now with the World War II veterans. We're talking like 70 something years later, almost 80 years later now. And these folks are starting to pass away, and a lot of their stories haven't been told. So I think that's one of the things with your book is that you've chronicled this, and you've really written it like it's kind of like a history textbook in a way, but because of the resources, but you tell it as a story, of the real people. It's almost like a biography too, you know.
Yeah, it's actually kind of like you're alluding to, two books in one. You have the story of my dad and his crew,
Right.
because the book's just not about my dad, but it's about what happened to each member of the crew, because something different happened to each guy, and it's also
Right.
about all the courageous Belgian people that risked their lives trying
Yeah.
to help them. So you have the story of my dad and his crew that reads like a novel, uh, even though it's all based on firsthand testimony. But then it's also like a history book, because that's what I provided, just a lot of historical information, and anecdotes about and surrounding the war to put the story in context and give it background. Because it's kind of like two books in one, like you're saying.
Yeah, and you have page after page after page of resources that you listed and then references, and then even in the index, there's like just there's a ton of just different information here. So anybody that would be interested in learning more about that, they can use it. And I think like I love history. I've always liked history, and I know there are a lot of people out there that like historical fiction, based off of true events. But this is really not a fiction story. This is really just a historical biography, or um, I don't know. I mean, like I know it's a history book, but it's more than just a history book. It's very informative and entertaining as well.
Yeah, it's like I said, the truth is stranger than fiction
Yeah,
sometimes. And the story of my dad and his crew, undoubtedly supports that fact.
yeah. You recently went on a trip to Europe for 3 weeks, didn't you?
Yeah, yeah. The impetus of the trip was to go over to Belgium again. It was my sixth trip. This time was for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium and of my dad's plane being shot down. And I was convinced relatives of four other crew members to come over. So there were about 22 of us, representing five of the 10 crew members that went to Belgium. Prior to Belgium, though, my wife and I went to England, to visit a bunch of 8th Air Force bomb group memorials and bomb group museums. We stayed in Bedford, which was near the air base where my dad was stationed at. He was with the 306 bomb group that was stationed at Thurley, England, which is about 60 miles north of London, a little bit west. I'm on the board of directors of the 306 Bomb Group Historical Association and past president. So that was a lot of fun. There's a nice little museum to the 306 there, and where the base used to be located. And then we drove all around. We were there for I guess it was 5 days, 6 nights, 5 days, and I drove 744 miles.
Oh wow.
And my wife was a nervous wreck the whole time, because you not only you're driving on the left side of the road, but the steering wheel's on the right side, so that's a little disoriented. And then almost every intersection's a roundabout that you have to navigate, and then those English country roads are so narrow. It seems like every time cars coming the other way, you're playing chicken with
Yeah,
it, and you're
yeah,
going to hit each other, and you just pass each other by inches.
yeah,
So
yeah.
so my wife didn't enjoy the driving too much, but we had a real good time.
Oh, that's good. What did you learn, or did you find out anything new?
Not was when I was in England, although it was very interesting and informative, going around to these other bomb group bases. One thing that was pretty cool, though, that I was interviewed on the BBC while I
Oh,
was over there on the
okay.
radio. That was cool. And then from England, we went over to Brussels, where we met up with a bunch of relatives from my family. And then we were in Belgium for 6 days. 3 of the days they had planned events, and there's a number of memorials that they've erected in the area. Uh, and on the anniversary dates of those memorials, they have celebrations. But the big celebrations are always centered around September 2nd, which was the date that the first village in Belgium, Cendron, was liberated by the U.S. 9th Infantry
Okay.
when they
Let's
crossed over from France into Belgium.
let's dig more into that when we come back. I've got to do a little station break, Steve, and we'll be right back. Everybody, you're listening to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul, and I'm your host, Adam Messer. My special guest today is Steve Snyder, who wrote the book called Shot Down, which is the true story of pilot Howard Snyder, his father, and the crew of the B-17 Susan Ruth.
WRUU 107.5 FM is a new and different listener-supported and all-volunteer community radio station for Savannah. Our diverse broadcast and web programming is supported by generous listeners who value our passion and spunk. We are independent of other media and receive no government or large corporate support. People like you are our largest and most important source of our funding. Go to WRUU.org to find out how you can make a one-time or a monthly contribution. Thank you.
The Live Oak Public Library System offers local residents access to hundreds of thousands of movies, television programs, albums, audiobooks, ebooks, and digital comic books for free on your streaming television and mobile devices through the Hoopla app. Supported devices include Roku, Fire, Apple TV, iPhone, and Android, among others. The selection is vast. All you'll need is your library card. Find the Hoopla app on your device and more information at liveoakpl.org.
WRUU-LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul.
And here is Sebastian Messer, everybody, with his metal musings. All right, everybody, if you're just now tuning in, you're listening to The Adam Messer Show, and I'm your host, Adam Messer, and my special guest today is Steve Snyder, who is the author of Shot Down, which is the true story of his father, who is a pilot named Howard Snyder, and the crew of the B-17, the Susan Ruth. You know, Steve, I tell you what, was your dad kind of a joker? Was he a little, did he have like a good sense of humor?
Yeah, he had a real good sense of humor.
Okay, so the reason I'm asking that is because I'm looking at this page 146. It says, Howard wrote, "It was a little chilly up there today, about 52 degrees below. Pendrick passed out from lack of oxygen when his connection parted and froze his face. He's in the hospital and probably won't be able to fly for months. He's a good lad too. I'm sorry to lose him. It was a lot rougher today than the last time. The last time was too easy. Colward was knocked off his feet while I was taking some rather abrupt evasive action to mess up a fighter attack. He hit his tailbone and was quite badly swollen today. He's going to the hospital tomorrow to have an x-ray taken. I hope there's nothing serious." I just like that opening line. Like, he's talking about a really serious situation, and he's not making light of it, but he's just kind of trying to find something, in there. He's like, it was a little chilly up there today, about 52 degrees below. Just a little bit, like, not very much. It's just, just a tad. I mean, like, if it's 52 degrees out here in Savannah, I'm wearing a jacket, let alone 52 below. And those guys, the pilots, they had their gear, but really, it wasn't like thermal type stuff that we have today.
Oh, no. Yeah, it was minus 40 to 60 degrees below zero at the altitude that they were flying, because back then those bombers were not pressurized.
Right.
So, I mean, when it rained, water would leak in the plane, and, they were drafty, and above 10,000 feet, they had to go on oxygen.
And they had to pump those planes out. Like they were pumping those, engines and the planes out like as quickly as they could get them.
Yeah. So yeah, it was frostbite was a huge problem. They were, like you were reading about one of my dad's waist gunners, John Pindrock. There were lots of airmen that were hospitalized for lengthy periods of time with serious frostbite injuries.
Yeah. What did your dad do after the war? What was his profession?
Well, he did all sorts of stuff after the war. When he first came back, he was a B-17 flight instructor for a while. Then he was air traffic controller for a short time, and then he opened a restaurant in Pasadena, and he owned and was the chef at the restaurant. It was called Snyder's for 10 years.
What kind of food did they serve?
It was back then. It was more like they were open for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but it was more like the restaurants then were more like coffee shops.
Oh yeah, okay. So like a diner.
They had like the soda fountain they had up front, but they had full dinners and stuff. And when I was a kid growing up, when I was little, we ate dinner there at the restaurant every night during the week, Monday through Friday, and then we had dinner at home on the weekends. So that was fun. I could go up there and have all the ice cream sundaes and sodas and malts and ice cream cones I wanted. So that was pretty cool growing up.
Oh yeah, that is neat. So that you were a little kid when he owned the restaurant?
Yeah, just he sold the restaurant just before I was old enough to start being a busboy at it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always putting my son to work.
I got all the benefits, but none of the work.
Yeah, I'm always putting my son to work. I'm like, hey kid, get over here and help me with this. He's a good kid. Oh man. So what?
And then he got into selling all different types of things after that.
Okay.
He kind of ended his working career. He had a company called Accra Stamp Machine Company, and you have to be old enough to remember this, but back in the 60s and 70s, particularly, they used to have redemption stamps when you went to the grocery store or bought gas at a gas station.
Yeah.
Depending on how much you spend, they give you these redemption stamps, and then you'd lick them and paste them into books and then redeem them for merchandise, for a blender or a vacuum cleaner or a washing machine or what have you. They were real popular. Accra Stamp Machine Company, they made it a dispenser that you dial like a telephone, had like an old dial telephone where you'd put the stamps in and then it'd come out.
Oh, okay. So just you'd put in like whatever number and it dispensed that many stamps.
Yeah. If you had like, $25 worth, you just put in 25 in the little dial, and then the stamps would all come out, and then the checker, the clerk, would give them to the customer, and then they'd take them home. That was a big. You have to be old enough to remember that, though.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like
not old enough to remember that.
We as a kid, I know they used to have these little. It wasn't that kind of thing, but I remember as a kid they used to talk about the ration stamps for the war. And
oh yeah, that was something different. Yeah,
totally different, but I mean, same kind of concept where it was like you'd lick the stamp and you'd use it for whatever, and but now they have, everything's like a reward program. It's like, punch in your phone number, or use your, scan your card or whatever, and they do the same kind of thing with like point rewards or whatever. So it's a pretty neat concept. It's been around for a while. So that's pretty cool. So right before we went to the break, we were talking a little bit about September the 2nd, right?
Yeah. The anniversary date of
Yeah,
the liberation of Belgium.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So as I said, there were about 10 of my family members, and then relatives of other members of the crew. And they had organized events at various memorials. They had one at the Susan Ruth Memorial to my dad and his crew. And they also had memorials to where the U.S. 9th Infantry first crossed over the Wartraws River from France into Belgium to liberate the country. And they're unbelievably events. They set up these huge tents that can hold hundreds and hundreds of people, and all the local villagers come out in these tents. They have band concerts and dances and dinners, and the local beer Chimay just flows. And the U.S. military is, sends representatives from the Air Force, the Belgian military, the French military, the U.S. ambassador, Ronald Gidwitz, is his name, to Belgium, came down with an entourage, representatives from NATO.
Oh, wow.
It's a big deal, and they're very moving events. The parties are fun, but then at these memorials, they're a lot more somber and reverent events. The Belgian people, to this day, they're still so thankful for the Allied countries coming to rescue them from Nazi oppression.
Yeah.
And occupation. That they're just still so grateful, so thankful, and they do a great job of educating the younger generations too to remember what took place and to honor the Allied troops that fought and died to free their country.
I remember as a kid, it wasn't so far removed when I was a kid. I went to school in the 80s, and I graduated in 94. And so it wasn't so far removed then because it was like, 40 years before or so. And I remember when the History Channel came out, it was like they played nonstop World War II stuff, when they first came out. And but I don't know that it's so prevalent today. With the younger generations, it kind of almost feels like a lot of it's not so much that people don't have respect for it anymore, but it's almost kind of like people have just kind of moved on.
That's really the reason I do what I do, is that, as you say, the memory of World War II, or the World War II is fading in people's memories because it was 75 years ago, and especially the younger generations just aren't aware of what was at stake in the sacrifice of those guys. There was no other event in history that affected more people than World War II. Every country was involved. 60 million people died. Millions more were wounded. Millions more were left homeless and displaced. It changed the course of America and the world forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, it's the mission of the 306 Bomb Group Historical Association, and really the goal of what I do is to remember, honor, and educate, to remember the air war over Europe, to honor the men who fought it, and to educate the public about it, especially younger generations.
Well, that's so appealing, I think, because when you think about it, a lot of the troops, a lot of the kids, there were kids that were like 14, 15, 16 that lied and snuck in, to get into the army or whatever. Because they wanted to serve, and then, like you said, your dad, he was 28, and he was considered, they called him pops, So a lot of the kids were, they were in their early 20s, maybe 18, 19, whatever, and think about like my son is 17, and he would have been a ripe age to go at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
So these were, well, it's I don't know how to say it, but I feel like I feel like technology has improved a lot, and I do agree. With like there's a lot of responsibilities, adult responsibilities that, I think that are harder now because we have so much access to technology. But there, even like my parents' generation, your generation, um, my generation, every time it seems like almost like uh, the generation before they were considered adults at a younger age. Like I remember my grandma, she was I think 14 when she got married, and I mean that's
Oh yeah,
I couldn't
yeah.
imagine a 14-year-old getting married today, but my great grandfather and my great grandmother, they were born in like 1910 and 1911. You know, and I want to say that I think my grandpa that served and he was born in like either the late teens or the early 20s. And they were considered to be, they were expected to do like adult things, at an early age. You know.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. That technology. It just life was a lot harder back then, and life gets easier every generation uh, because of technology. Because you have uh, all the innovations doing a lot of the work for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, they and another thing that people don't really have to take into consideration when World War II broke out. The United States, really the world too, but the United States was a totally different country. Back then, the majority of the people lived in rural areas.
They didn't have
In the
cars.
country,
There weren't big grocery
unlike
stores.
today, where most people live in the cities,
Yeah.
and there was no, no one flew unless airline flight, unless you were super rich.
I read something one
Um,
time, Steve, that back then people didn't even have, they had like ice boxes and ice chests versus
oh
having a
yeah,
refrigerator. A lot of people didn't
and
have running water or electricity.
that's right. They had to hang their clothes up on, the clotheslines to dry them.
I mean, you think about
Put
that
them
and it's
through
like,
a wringer. You had to work.
yeah,
When you were young, you were expected to start working at a really young age.
yeah. And I'm not saying that to knock any of the generations because honestly, like the baby boomer generation that came after the greatest generation, they were the hippies and then there were conservatives, and so their growing up was completely different than their parents growing up. They grew up in the Depression, and then their kids, the Gen X and the Millennials, the way that they were raised was completely different than the way that they were raised, and the kids coming up after that, the Gen Zs, and it's not to knock anybody, it's just to try to give a perspective of, these young folks that went off and fought, and it was like you said, it was the entire world. It wasn't just the United States. It wasn't just Europe. It was the entire world trying to fight for freedom. And you had the Axis and the Allies, and these were kids basically going off to war to do these things to fight for freedom and to fight. Like you said, the Belgium folks, they still appreciate that because they can look back and say, oh, this wasn't that long ago. I mean, this, you could say today it was like, maybe somebody's great grandparent fought in World War II. My grandparents fought. Your dad, you know what I mean? It's not that far removed to say, okay, this is what we're looking at. And somebody posted the other day, just to kind of give a perspective, but Barbara Walters, Martin Luther King, and Anne, gosh, what is her name? The Diary of Anne Frank. Anne Frank. They were all born in the same year, right? And it was talking about the perspective of, okay, well, we know Barbara Walters, Martin Luther King, and Anne Frank, and we kind of think of those time periods as being separated, like the 40s and the 60s and today, but we're talking about the span of someone's lifetime.
Yeah.
And how many things changed. 75 years is, the average, I guess, life expectancy in the U.S. It might be a little more now, but, You think about 75 years. That's someone's life. And how much the world's changed since then. So I've always had a reverence and admiration for, the folks that, that they buckled down and they sacrificed and they, I mean, like the stories of people like scrapping stuff, for bullets, and they stopped what they were doing. They changed over factories to produce war machines, and everybody got involved. Everybody did something. They had their part to play in that. And I've always thought that was just like you said, it was like one of the worst things that ever happened in the history of the world. But I also think it's one of the greatest things that ever happened because of the grit and the determination that the folks had to come together and say, oh, you know what, we're not, we're going to do this together.
Yeah, they did. They were, as I was saying, people didn't travel back then. There were no, there wasn't TV, there wasn't internet, and so you didn't know that much about the rest of the world. And a lot of these guys, they're living out in the country, had never even been out of their home county.
Right.
And all of a sudden, they find themselves halfway across the world fighting in a war.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they either came out of high school or came out of college or
off the farm.
It was
or wherever.
It was very parochial back then. People, congregated with people like themselves.
Oh yeah.
And all of a sudden, you're in the Army, you're Air Force, and there's all these guys. You're with all these guys from different nationalities, different religions, and so it was.
From different countries too. They fought.
It was a shock. It was a shock for them.
Yeah, it was culture shock and everything.
They'd never even been away from home. Never would have been away from their parents, their mother. All of a sudden, here they're someplace else in the world, and they basically can do anything they want. Now they can smoke, they can drink, they can have sex for the first. They were free to do what they wanted to do. They grew up real quick.
Yeah, didn't they used to give cigarettes as part of the rations?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And your the C rations, you'd get cigarettes.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna wrap up this first hour, Steve, and we're gonna be coming back at the 4:00 hour. So we're gonna take you and I are gonna take a little break, and everybody else tuning in, please listen to these important announcements, and we'll be back at 4:00.